Live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's Performance in the Management of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. The effective management of Zimbabwe's resources allocated to fight COVID-19 is critical. How effectively and transparently the Zimbabwean government spends COVID-19 resources can make a massive difference in Zimbabwe's fight against the pandemic and will play a huge role in the economic upturn of Zimbabwe's economy. Accountability on who, what and to whom public resources are spent and the public dissemination of that information can go a long way to ensuring that such resources are spent on the things they are intended for. Joining us on our show today to discuss taking stock on Zimbabwe's performance with regard to management of COVID-19 resources, we are joined in the studio by Samuel Matikiti, Transparency International Zimbabwe Research and Advocacy Officer. And joining us virtually during the show, we will be joined by Dr. Ruth Laborde, Chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health, Nyasha Chizu, CEO of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, PRAZ, and Prosper Chitambara, an economic analyst. Samuel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andy, for having me, and good evening, listeners.
Now then, if you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. Samuel, what is TIZ's opinion and what do you have to say about the general procurement process and state of contracts in the health sector?
Thank you very much, Andy, for that question. Initially, let me start by saying, if we try to look at the state of corruption in our country, it's so rotten, so to say. Initially, I would like to say, if you try to look at those international instruments, international indices that actually assess the nature in which we actually deal with corruption in our country, you would notice that according to Afrobarometer, the 2019, about 60% of respondents, they actually indicated that corruption is actually increasing in Zimbabwe. And about 70% of the respondents, according to Afrobarometer, they actually indicated that the government is actually doing little in terms of the fight against corruption in our country. So even if you had to go and assess the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, again, as Zimbabwe, we are scoring at least 22 out of 100, showing at least how corruption is so endemic in our country and some loopholes in terms of how we fight corruption as a nation. So initially, I would say Zimbabwe, in terms of corruption, we are way back in terms of fighting corruption, and we are actually doing little. In as much as there are efforts in trying to combat corruption, it's really a sad story that we are each and every day talking about corruption, having idle talks without tangible evidence on how best we are actually doing and dealing with corruption. Then move on to the procurement process in general. I would say, according to our constitution, if you go through section 309 of the constitution, which mandated the Auditor General or Maichiri's report, over the past years, if not 3 years, you would notice that a lot of issues around violation of procurement procedures, they are so rampant. The recent report by Auditor Generals, the 2019 report by Auditor Generals, have actually noticed that there is a lot of corruption that is happening when it comes to issues around procurement in Zimbabwe. You would notice that a case in point is of ZETDC, a subsidiary of ZESA Holdings, as well as ZPS. They had to procure transformers that were never delivered. Again, you could tell a lot of money is being lost through procurement and goods that are not actually being delivered. So it's really a challenge when it comes to procurement in our country. A case in point, again, according to the recent Auditor General's reports, you can notice the GMB, which actually made an advance payment of over $1 million to procure 4.2 metric tons of maize, but they were never delivered. So you could tell, as a nation, we are losing a lot through corruption, be it grant or petty corruption. But however, in terms of grand corruption, that's where we see how those people who are actually politically exposed, or people who are actually close to power, taking advantage of the current situation to actually divert funds that could have actually benefited the general citizens. So issue around procurement, of course, we might say we have the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Act, which is actually a very good act. We also have PRAZ as well, which is actually a very good body which provide an oversight role in terms of procurement. Of course, they are there.
Right. Now, I mean, of course, let's be also clear, though. Of course, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission is also mandated to look at some of these issues. So if any of this type of corruption is supposed to be highlighted, you're supposed to report it to them, and they are supposed to investigate and take action. I mean, that is the whole concept of ZAC, is it not?
Exactly. We are saying ever since we were into the new dispensation, we have seen positive strides from the government in trying to combat corruption. We have seen, again, the restructuring of ZAC, which is a positive move. We have seen the formation of the Special Anti-Corruption Unit within the Presidential Office, or even the ZRP. We even have NPRC, again, taking this fight against corruption to another level.
Okay. Now then, you heard what Samuel there was talking about, procurement processes, and now we are joined virtually by Nyasha Chizu. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, PRAZ. Nyasha, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Afternoon, sir. Now, Nyasha, let's just, as I say, I always like to start at the basics. What is the role of PRAZ in public procurement, particularly looking at the health sector?
Our role is the name of the institution tells we are the regulator of public procurement.
Okay. All right.
So one of the issues that we do is to give technical guidelines when it comes to public procurement processes. So our role is merely overseeing, setting standards, and ensuring that procuring entities comply with the laws when they are procuring goods and services.
Right.
So you will notice, yes, the issues I was listening to my colleague here talking about the issues of corruption. Mm-hmm. Yes, those things are actually evident. We are seeing them. And if you look at what the Auditor General's report was highlighting, most of the issues are things that were coming from the old dispensation where we used to have our Procurement Act, which in terms of regulation, it was very limited. That act could not actually have a process that could be prosecuted easily because the law was very weak. Mm. But now that we have the new Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Act, we have now the foundation of setting up systems that are going to be effective in the management of corruption. So one of the issues that we are working on, apart from just having the law that defines how public procurement is supposed to be conducted, we are also working on issues like the electronic government procurement system. We are in the process of acquiring that system because you will notice that corruption is as a result of processes that are not transparent, processes that are not fair, and the only thing that you can use is electronic systems to minimize the issues of discretion that happen in public procurement. So yes, we like what my colleague is saying in terms of our perception in corruption. Yes, it's still very low because we are working on the systems that would make it possible for us to eliminate the possibilities of corruption in public procurement.
Now, during this pandemic, it's a fact that government relaxed the procurement regulations or procurement requirements, obviously to react to what's happening in terms of the pandemic and getting things to Zimbabwean citizens quicker. But of course, that doesn't mean that procurement, if I can put it, guidelines need to be ignored. Doesn't it more mean that we need to do things quicker and smarter? What was your take on that?
Yes, you will notice that what was relaxed was not the process. What was relaxed by our circular when it comes to COVID was things to do with the timelines that are required to turn around the procurement process. Ordinarily, you would say if it's a domestic tender, you need to float it for 20 days. When it's an international tender, you need to float it for 40 days. But you can't do that in a situation like we are. So what we simply did was that procuring entities could now turn around the initial procurements within 48 hours. Then you adopt now the timelines that are would give an opportunity for the market to respond when you have managed the surge which we experienced when we started with COVID. So the issue that we only did was to invoke the provisions of the Act, which deals with the management of public procurement in an emergency situation. So you will notice when we talk about COVID requirements, there are standard common use items that are required. The equipment is required. Yes, there are some instances where when we talk of these isolation centers, we are talking of some construction that needs to be done. So this is where we said you can use the law, which says that when you're in an emergency situation, Section 33 would say you go for direct procurement, where you do your due diligence on the costs and also the scope of the work. Then you engage a contractor, turn around that procurement quickly. But when we come to the other procurements of the standard common use items, we are saying, yes, we know that we need sanitizer, we know that we need masks, we know that we need equipment, protective clothing. So we cannot be in panic every day during all the pandemic period, because we are saying these things, we know what we want. What we don't know is the quantum of what we want. So let's put in systems so that we can have suppliers competing to deliver those goods to the public sector.
Nyasha, you did mention yourself about trying to enhance or increase transparency in the whole tender process. And I think, and you did talk about moving to electronic base, but that's also in the future. So as we talk right now, there is a perception that the tender process is not transparent, which means that you can't hold people accountable if it's incorrect or done wrong. So what mechanisms are in place in the current system to ensure transparency and that tenders are done properly at the right price and with the right people?
What we have put in with our circular number 1 of 2020 was that when we are looking at this procurement of standard common use items, we said government need to identify one lead procuring entity who would go to the market for everyone, so that we can have control of issues of pricing, issues of who is doing what. And we actually said, because this is a nationwide thing, is that agent will need to establish what we call framework arrangements within provinces. When we talk of framework arrangements, we are talking of an arrangement where we agree on the criteria of the supplier and also the specifications of the commodities. We also agree on the terms and conditions. So we would have many suppliers on a framework, let's say to supply our sanitizer. Then, when the state entities now want to procure, they would simply call in quotations from those suppliers that are on the framework. We are no longer going to be evaluating the supplier, the product, and the terms and conditions because they are already agreed. What we are only evaluating is the price. So with that system, we are capable of ensuring that the procurement process is transparent and it's also competitive. But what we have noticed is the element of establishing these frameworks has not been done in the spirit of the directive, that they were supposed to be done at provincial level, and in some cases even at district level, because they're saying we want to use the procurement process to be able to be effective in the management of COVID. So we cannot have contracts being run centrally for everything when these things could be done at a lower level. So as a regulator now, what we are now going into now is we're reviewing those procurement processes to see whether the procurements have been done in the spirit of the directive that we gave. Right. It was not actually a directive that was outside the law. We directed the procuring entities to use the provisions of the law because this is a new law, so we just head start to advise procuring entities of what to do.
Thank you. Nyasha Chizu, Chief Executive Officer of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, PRAZ. Many thanks for appearing on the show.
Thank you.
Now, we'll have to take a short breather. If you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's Performance in the Management of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. After the breather, we will be joined by Dr. Ruth Labode, Chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health. Don't go away. We will be right back.
Coronavirus is a threat to all humanity. It has killed over 350,000 people so far, and many others are in quarantine away from their loved ones. We are fortunate to be alive, but no one knows how and when the virus will strike closer to home. You and I are each other's keeper. With winter upon us, let's ensure that none of us will be exposed to the elements that make us vulnerable to COVID-19. Let's help those in need by contributing to the Zimbabwe's COVID-19 fund. The proceeds will go towards equipping underdeveloped health centers and communities. To contribute, dial or SMS the following numbers on your screen. Remember, if we stand together, we win together.
Welcome back. You're watching Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's Performance in the Management of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now, Samuel, before the break, we had Nyasha Chizu, the Chief Executive Officer of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe. Prayers, thank you. And he went through a lot of procurement rules, the Circular Number 1 of 2020 about trying to make tendering process or procurement process more transparent. But there was one issue that we didn't have a chance to talk to him. That's about information dissemination. So I'd like you to comment on that. And also, secondly, I understand that TIZ is currently doing a report called Corruption Risk Assessment in the Health Sector. Maybe as well you could talk us through that.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in Zimbabwe is we have good laws. For example, Mr. Chiuzi talked about the public, the PDD Act that we have. It's actually a good document that actually surpassed the previous act that we had on public procurement. But however, the issue boils down to how do people really, or do people in various institutions have an understanding of what the act actually does, or what are the advantages or disadvantages that the act has. So it's all about information. If people had understanding of what actually is contained within this act, it would be very useful. But however, information gap as to how best someone can actually bid for those tenders, how best can someone go about competing for tender is actually missing in our country, which is actually a gap that we actually notice as Transparency International. And there is a lot that needs to be done in trying to ensure that everyone is actually abreast with such kind of information as to how one has to go about when it comes to procurement in our country. And
then very quickly about your new report that you're coming up with, very quickly.
Thank you. We have conducted a research in 2016 where we were actually looking at some of corruption within the health sector. But however, we thought we should actually do an in-depth research into corruption risks that are actually inherent within the health sector. I think from our pre-finding so far, we've noticed that there is a lot of corruption that is actually happening within the health sector, starting from procurement as well, procurement of drugs in itself. And however, looking at the nature of the health sector in our country, where we are saying we are not actually abiding by international instruments to which we are a signatory to. For example, the Budget Declaration, which actually stipulates that at least 15% of the budget should be actually allocated to health.
When do you think that this report or research report will be out?
End of this month, 3 weeks from now.
So we look forward to analyzing that here on ZTN and on the show. Anyway, we are now joined virtually by Dr. Ruth Labode, Chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health. Ruth, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
How are you today?
I'm good.
That's good. Ruth, now you chair Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health. Is Parliament being effective in terms of its constitutional oversight role in management of COVID-19 funds and resources in the health sector?
That's a big question, but I'll tell you, we were effective in the assessment of the preparedness of our isolation centers initially, before the pronouncement of the lockdown. When the pronouncement of the lockdown was done, we automatically disconnected from the whole process. And I believe that's where a lot of issues began, because now somehow the lockdown became a fertile space for corruption. You could actually do what you want and in your own capacity in the name of emergency. This is why we're faced a lot of these things we are seeing. I remember when we went around, we went to Wilkins, we went to Thorn Grove, we raised the issues, and they were taken into consideration. Thorn Grove was renovated, Wilkins was taken over. I'm told Tagwire even did another hospital, renovated another hospital in Harare. Accident was given to the private sector, who received the donor funding, or I don't know, donor, or put in their money and got some money from somewhere. But the disclosure, that's where the problem is. Mm-hmm. The disclosure of one, what did Mtuli put into COVID from Fiscus, and where did it go? We don't know.
But Ruth, if I can ask you this though, I mean, you may not know that now, but surely your committee is mandated constitutionally when you eventually come back to Parliament and have a full committee sitting, you are mandated to ask those type of questions?
Yes, we'll ask, no, trust me, already we are back into Parliament. The minister came and presented the epidemiological statement, and he has presented a statement to Parliament. But we as a committee are now going to be calling specific people. For example, we will call the Minister of the Department of Accounts, the Procurement Department from the Ministry of Health, even especially NATFAM. For Siseko now, after authorizing an order to drugs, is instructed to recall, and she's recalling. What did she approve? On what basis did she make that decision? She's a professional, that woman, a pharmacist for that matter. Mm.
Now, if I can ask you, I mean, I know you've obviously, even though you say that you have, because Parliament wasn't sitting due to the COVID-19 lockdown, you have been obviously not sitting idle. So have you identified specific red flags or any challenges or gaps around issues of management of COVID-19 resources?
I have. I strongly feel there was no transparency to start with. Starting with the Ministry of Finance itself. And this is what, and then going to the Ministry of Health. How could the Minister of Health say, oh, don't worry, drugs has reduced the cost of masks from 900,000 to 600,000? Which country does that? Where does that happen? Is this a supermarket or a flea market where you go and reduce a price of a good?
But Ruth, if I can ask you though.
That one is a problem for us. Also problematic, you asked me for that.
Yeah, if I can ask you though, I mean, you keep raising drugs, but really drugs is much more about a social media issue. I mean, we haven't yet seen the contract. No one has really seen the contract or not. So, and it was overturned by the cabinet, in fact, under the president. So, is that a good example to use? I mean, it was cancelled and it...
No, I'll tell you why it is a good example. It is a precursor to what else we have not seen. It is actually, but it is telling us something is wrong. Some wrong things were done. And we really need to have a closer look at some of the procurement systems, what was used, what was not procured. For me, it's not even only government. Even these institutions, we need to know what did Tagwire put in Wilkins.
Yeah. Now,
those things will walk away if we don't. If there are 30 ventilators there, which cost I don't know how many million, who knows about them? Those are the things we are going to be following about. Now, Ruth, it's a private hospital, but we're interested.
Yeah, okay, if you don't mind, because unfortunately we're running out of time, but look, this is something about the future. Now, natural disasters are here to stay. In fact, it's not if, but when the next one will come. And as the old saying says, nothing is perfect. So do you or your committee have any recommendations for future similar situations on how Zimbabwe procurement process can be improved?
Zimbabwe has a very good procurement process, but we are naturally corrupt. There's even an act which, if it is followed properly, things can be done properly. Even there's an emergency preparedness strategy there on the ground, but it is not funded, so it cannot be implemented. I think we need to start reinforcing, using the same documents we have created, but making sure that those who flout them actually are punished.
Dr. Ruth Labode, Chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health. Many thanks for participating on the program.
Thank you.
Samuel, you heard there what Dr. Labode was saying about Parliament not really being involved once the lockdown happened, of course, because Parliament basically adjourned for the lockdown person. They're now doing it virtually. However, I want to really talk about the future in terms of what what gaps are there and the red flags are there in terms of how to improve something? We always say things are never ever perfect. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. It could be in the Europe, USA, and America. There are always going to be corrupt people. There's always going to be procurement holes that people try and do. I think there's some cases, as you know, as TIZ. So maybe you could comment on some of the issues Ruth raised.
Thank you very much, Indy. I think like what Dr. Laboto was saying, issue of Parliament is very crucial in terms of playing its oversight role. We have noticed that during the early stages of the lockdown, it was on lockdown as well, which had actually implication towards transparency and accountability. But however, having Parliament playing its role in future disaster is actually crucial to ensure that there is transparency and accountability in terms of how we manage resources, how we manage all those resources that we are receiving to actually combat issues to do with disaster management in our country. So Parliament, I believe, should always play its role in future whenever we experience what disasters, so that at least we won't have issues around corruption when it comes to proper management in terms of efficiency and effectiveness of the resources that we receive or that we dedicate as a country towards response to certain disasters.
Now, I want to tie in both Nyasa Chizu from the PRAS and also Dr. Ruth Labode, who of course sits on the chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health, about transparency and accountability in the process. You know, and Nyasha talked about his number 1 of 2020, the circular about procurement rules in terms of this, also about how we've changed in terms of the epidemic and how procurement has changed. But still, transparency and accountability, knowing who, when and why it's being paid for. Comment on that. What can we do more about that?
Initially, I know as a government or as a nation, we are not supposed to actually deviate from the rules and regulations that we have set for ourselves to promote transparency and accountability. But however, in terms of disaster management, like what Mr. Chizu was saying, of course, there should be something. For example, during this whole period of COVID-19, we wanted procurement of resources, medical equipment to curb the outbreak or the spread of COVID-19. However, this should be done quickly, but with due diligence, of course, rather than actually deviating or diverting from the rules that we have set. Because the moment we try to divert or to relax some of the laws that we have, it opens actually floodgates for corruption to happen. That will be an opportunity for other people to take advantage to enrich themselves at the expense of the citizens that will be suffering, that will need quick attention towards the disaster that could have actually affected the country.
Utilizing a disaster for personal gain. We have to take a short breather. If you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's Performance in the Management of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. In our final segment, we will be joined by Prosper Chitambara, an economic analyst. Don't go away. We will be right back.
Over 355,000 people globally have died of COVID-19 coronavirus. Of this figure, Africa accounts for over 3,600 deaths. Zimbabwe currently has over 132 active cases, and the number keeps on rising.
Hi guys, my name is KVG and I am a presenter-producer at Star FM, sounding good all the time. Well, listen guys, I've decided to take action to be part of this amazing initiative, and I'm inviting you, yes you, to be part of this amazing campaign and make a difference as we fight against COVID-19.
Everyone has a talent, a gift, and the willpower to make a positive change. We all need to make sure we play our part in the Zim Papers COVID-19 fundraising campaign. I'm DJ Mox.
Ndini wenyu Humba Makombe Tendenya Kupfuya. Ndinokukokai kuti mushande pamwechete nesu muchirongwa cheZim Papers COVID-19 campaign, apo tiri kuunganidza zvipo zvakasiyana-siyana kuti tibatsire vamwe vari kuremerwa vatinogara navo.
We're inviting you to donate as individuals, as families, as corporates, as NGOs. No gift is too little. Let's support our essential services in the fight against COVID-19. And of course, let's give goods to our vulnerable communities. I'm Folake.
I'm Rumbadzai. Our hotline numbers are as follows: 0800 777 444 up to 9 or 0715 679 405. Please don't hesitate to visit any of our Zim Papers social media platforms for any additional information. Remember, all of our Zim Papers centers and offices are collection points.
Together we stand.
Together we win.
Welcome back. You're watching Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's performance in the management of COVID-19 resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe TIZ. Keep your comments and views coming in, please, via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, and via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Now, Samuel, one area that Ruth touched on was the issue of a anti-corruption strategy as a nation, and I know TIZ was advocating for that as way back as early 2019, and it appears that it's still being implemented or being written. Maybe you could just comment on that. How far away are we from a national anti-corruption strategy, and when do you think that we can actually see it on board, and what should be in it?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think first I would like to say, we are a signatory to United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and if you go through Article 5 of the convention, it actually requires every member state to have a strategy or mechanism, or to put in place strategies to combat corruption. So as an organization, we actually advocate for one such kind of strategy, because we are signatory to United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and we have seen the government responding positively through ZAC. They have actually conducted their research in terms of coming up with a strategy, and as we speak right now, ZAC is in the process of finalizing the anti-corruption strategy. Actually, I would say they have actually their last stage in terms of this strategy, and we are hoping through the pillars that are actually contained in this strategy, they will be helpful in terms of fighting or curbing corruption in our country. It's not all about fighting corruption, but curbing and pushing deterrence measures in future, so that at least we can reduce the level of corruption in our country. So we're just hoping, or we're very unfortunate that COVID-19 had to just come up before the strategy is out.
We are going to go over to Prosper, but before I do, I just wanted to just very briefly ask you this. I mean, it's all well and good having an anti-corruption strategy on paper, but implementation is critical as well, and also the financing and support for that monetarily to actually make it effective. Just very briefly, your comment to that.
That's the biggest challenge that we have as a country. We have good policies on paper, but however, when it comes to implementation, the execution, that's where the challenge is. But we hope that when it comes to implementation of this strategy, due diligence will be done, and every effort will be put, resources, financial, whatever, human resources, so that at least we have effectiveness and efficiency in terms of this strategy in curbing corruption in our country.
Joining us now virtually is Prosper Chitambara, an economic analyst. Prosper, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, Prosper, is open contracting during COVID-19 feasible? And can open contracting be a progressive norm to be used in the fight against corruption?
Yes, my view is that it's quite feasible, and it's also very beneficial. So essentially, open contracting refers to the publication, the disclosure of government contracts from the whole value chain, the awarding process, to the monitoring and evaluation of contract implementation. One of the benefits, apart from just ensuring that we deal with issues of corruption, is that it also results in a reduction in procurement costs, which gives value for money in terms of economic development.
Right. Now, in your opinion, what do you think the government should do to improve policy around emergency procurement, especially looking at the health sector?
Well, I think there are two things that are important in my view. Number one, we need to ensure there is effective participation by civil society, especially in the monitoring and evaluation of these procurement processes as well as contracts. We also probably need to ensure that we digitize the whole process. I think that's the global best practice. When you look at countries that are doing well in terms of procurement, especially emergency procurement, they are having to go the route of digitalization.
Right. Now, I mean, the government of Zimbabwe has made it one of their planks or their priorities to fight corruption. Maybe we can talk about some of the numbers. How much does corruption cost the country? And also, how much more effort should we put in terms of fighting corruption in Zimbabwe?
We did a study some few years back, and we actually found out that corruption imposes a 20% premium on the cost of doing business in general. So corruption results in a high cost of doing business. And of course, government has been implementing ease of doing business reforms. The pace has been a bit sluggish, but we hope that we can expedite, especially the institutional reform framework. So at least once you have strong institutions, that also tends to provide a disincentive for corrupt activities.
Now, I'm sure you were listening to Nyasha Chizu, the CEO of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, and of course my guest in studio, Samuel Matikiti, concerning really about gaps or opportunities in the health sector procurement process. So I just want to ask you, Prosper, how do you think, nothing is ever perfect, how do you think that this whole procurement process can be tightened up and made much more efficient to fight against corruption? And what would your recommendations be?
I think my recommendations will be around making sure that at least it's the whole process is inclusive, especially to the civil society, like I've already highlighted. And once you do that, you also strengthen issues of accountability, issues of mutual responsibility and accountability. We also need to ensure there is effective communication, especially from the authorities, effective public disclosure of the contract details and also the bids. I think there are a number of things that need to be effectively communicated. So communication is key, and also using the digital economy to facilitate that communication.
Now, you heard Dr. Ruth Laborde, chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health, talking about how she felt her committee, since the lockdown, hadn't really played its oversight role effectively. How critical is that? And what do you think should now happen in terms of Parliament's oversight role?
I think the role of Parliament oversight can never be overemphasized, and of course the restrictions, I think they affected the capacity of Parliament to physically meet. But I think that there are also opportunities for Parliament to take advantage of the virtual economy, the internet rather, to meet virtually and to provide oversight to some of these contracts. I think Parliament is very, very critical in terms of ensuring that we strengthen transparency and we enhance accountability around public procurement.
Prosper Chitambara, economic analyst, many thanks for appearing on the program.
Thank you so much.
Samuel, you heard Prosper there and what he was saying, and tying in both what Dr. Ruth Laborde and also Nyasha Chizu was saying. But I think one of the areas I want to talk to you about is about what citizens can do, because I think that's critical. Because in your report, looking through it, one of the areas that citizens are complaining about mostly is the area of getting free drugs, or getting drugs which are supposed to be free and they're having to pay for them. I think that's one of the major concerns of citizens. So what do they do? Can they come to TIZ? What does TIZ do? What is the process? I think that's where we talk about communication and information. It's similar applies to people who have been on the brunt of corruption at lower levels.
Thank you very much. In terms of drug, I think that's the major concerns with citizens when it comes to drugs, because you would notice that in either council clinics or in either public healthcare facilities, issues around drugs, they are being sold behind the back door. You go there, you try to seek medication, but however, people are conniving. All the health care workers, be it doctors, be it nurses, they actually connive to sell drugs behind the back doors, which actually disadvantage people who will be looking for drugs. But however, it boils down to the issue of the channels that we have in terms of identifying these corruption risks and vulnerabilities, and how citizens are supposed to report corruption. There is still a missing component within our country where how best can citizens take if they encounter counter corruption happening within the health sector, how do they go about reporting such kind of cases
because
of corruption?
Because they need those drugs, so if they don't pay that, they remain sick. So how do they go about that? That's the million-dollar question.
Exactly, that's a very good question. But I would say it's really problematic in the sense that we have normalized corruption. If you can't pay for those drugs through illegal means, you won't survive.
Which is obviously, that cannot help our citizens in any way.
So it goes again to the issue of our governance structure. How basically are we doing to try and ensure that we provide drugs in every hospital so that every citizen who seek medication can access them freely and at a very affordable prices. So it's really a question of how are we fighting corruption as a nation so that those loopholes and gaps that are inherent within the health sector can be actually kept.
So, and to fight that, it isn't really about individual smaller people. It's about making sure the policies, the implementation of the right policies are in place and, of course, as I said, implemented properly. I mean, that's the key, isn't it?
Then again, sensitization of the people as well. It's actually key. Because some of the people, they don't even know if they are doing right or right or wrong. So sometimes people need to be educated on the effects of corruption themselves. How best can we deal with corruption? How do they view corruption as an individual? So sensitization, capacitating people is actually key as well in combating corruption within the health sector.
Now, Samuel, as we come to the end of our show, I have a final question. I've asked each of our guests today this question. Do you see any gaps, opportunities in the health sector procurement process? And if you do, what would be your recommendations to tighten them up?
Thank you very much. I think the biggest gap that is there within the health sector is, as a country, we are not actually abiding to some of the international regional instruments. For example, budgeting, like what I said, budgeting or set aside 50% of the budget according to our budget declaration, so that if you have enough resources, enough funding of the health sector, of course, it will reduce the amount of corruption that is actually in the health sector. For example, we actually witness an increase in terms of the salaries of the people who are actually working within the health sector. So it's actually key. We have to abide by some of those principles to which we are signatory to. Then at the same time, you would notice that there is actually political will in terms of fighting against corruption. Of course, we might have people at the top who are actually willing to fight corruption, but at the bottom, there are so many people who are taking advantage of the loopholes that are there for them to enrich themselves. So how best can we do and how best can we plug systems which are actually effective to combat corruption in our country? So gaps, they are there. Of course, as a nation, we are supposed to be abiding some of these instruments, but as well, issues to do with the socio-economic or economic meltdown in our country is actually key, because people are trying to earn a living through whatever means, because the economy is a bit down.
So there's a direct correlation between the state of the economy, economic state of citizens, and the increase in corruption.
Precisely, precisely.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our program today. A very exciting program it was. You've been watching Taking Stock on Zimbabwe's performance in the management of COVID-19 resources. We'd like to thank our panelists, Samuel Matikiti, Transparency International Zimbabwe TIZ, Senior Research and Advocacy Officer. Samuel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Ruth Laborde, Chairperson of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health. Nyasha Chizu, Chief Executive Officer of the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, PRAZ, and Prosper Chitambara, Economic Analyst. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe TIZ. If you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. A final comment. When governments spend taxpayers' money on contracts with private companies to provide public goods, services and infrastructure, there's too often room for bad planning, mismanagement and corruption. In many countries, staggering amounts of tax money are not used as planned and fail to deliver promised results. However, the public contracting process can be complex, opaque and difficult to understand. The concept of open contracting is emerging as a strategy to increase contract transparency and monitoring, with major expected benefits in terms of quality of governance, better value for money, reduced corruption, increased service delivery, and better development outcomes. Emerging good practice in this area involves mandated or non-mandated proactive disclosure of contract information in user-friendly formats, from the awarding process to the monitoring and evaluation of contract implementation, with open access to the public, ideally through online platforms. There is a clear public interest in publishing contract information, as such information relates to the use of taxpayers' money and how it is being allocated and distributed. Maybe it is time that Zimbabwe does exactly that. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.